Joining me now from Paris is Nick Nuttall, spokesperson for the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change. And from Beijing, Wang Tao, he is a resident scholar at the Carnegie-Tsinghua Center for Global Policy in Beijing. Let's go to Nick Nuttall in Paris, first of all, the center of the action. Look, very complicated couple of weeks coming up, but let's try and distill it. First of all, will we get a climate deal? What will it look like? Will it be enough? And who's going to pay for it?
Well, we will get a deal at the end of these 2 weeks. We're absolutely convinced about that. The level of ambition is the thing to watch out for. What would be considered success would be that, well, we already have a success. We already have over 180 countries who have put down national action plans. These are aimed at cutting emissions and keeping the world under a 2-degree centigrade temperature rise. At the moment, they don't deliver that, but they're certainly a very big step forward. Instead of heading for, say, a 4-degree or a 5-degree world at the end of this century, these climate action plans, by various assessments, get us down to, say, a 3-degree world, maybe slightly more, slightly less. So what Paris has to do is harvest these climate action plans, put in place some kind of ratcheting process in which each 5 years or so countries will ratchet up their ambition to keep us under that 2-degree centigrade rise. And we also need to make sure the finance is available. You know, rich countries have promised developing countries $100 billion by 2020. There are a lot of estimates around right now. By some estimates, we're at around $60 billion in terms of those financial flows. And we'll have to see. There's another 5 years to go towards that. So these are some of the elements of success that would make a Paris Agreement really sing for the world and deliver what's needed.
Obviously, there is a lot of world leaders there trying to give impetus at the start of these talks. The US and China, the two biggest emitters in the world, also helping these talks along by announcing a joint climate plan back in November last year. Let's just have a listen to China's President Xi Jinping at the opening of COP21.
China pledges to peak CO2 emissions by around 2030 and strive to achieve it as soon as possible. And by 2030, reduce CO2 emissions per unit of GDP by 60 to 65% over the 2005 level.
Wang Tao in Beijing, there's the Chinese president. Do you think these targets set by China are achievable? And will they join with the rest of the world in revising these targets going forward to make sure they're more and more ambitious?
Yes, Nathan, I think these targets are the targets that have been fully considered in the Chinese government. And when they promised those targets to the international community in November last year, they are very certain that they're very confident that these targets will be achieved. And as President Xi just mentioned, that China will try to achieve these targets as soon as possible. So we're not only talking about peak the carbon emission by 2030, we're talking about achieving that as early as possible and latest 2030. So certainly they will also join the international community in trying to ratchet up the efforts to try to make bigger contributions whenever it's possible.
You know, Nick, we've seen the smog in Beijing today. We understand, you know, China obviously gets this in terms of having to deliver for its people. But it's a big world out there. And in his speech, President Xi Jinping also recognized there is a lot of countries that are still developing rapidly that need to burn fossil fuels in order to develop. That was echoed by India's Prime Minister Narendra Modi at the start, Nick. How can you square the circle of development and the fact that these carbon emissions need to rise for these countries to be join the developing world?
Well, you know, there are many, many more opportunities now for different kinds of energy sources that countries can use. I mean, it's absolutely clear that, you know, fossil fuels are going to be with us for many years to come. But it's a question of the mix between the renewable energies, the clean energies, but also energy efficiency and also fossil fuels. Because if we just carry on burning as we have done over the last 200 years, then we will shortly run out of the budget that is allowable, the budget that the atmosphere can actually hold in terms of emissions, and we will start tipping the Earth and its people well into much, much more higher temperatures. So, I mean, look, we are at a turning point right now. The world is changing enormously around us, almost unnoticed by so many, whether it be investors with trillions of dollars getting out of fossil fuels into clean energy, cities with 100% renewable energy targets, large corporations like IKEA and Walmart, all setting amazing targets. So things are moving, but there will be still some fossil fuels that will be burnt, and each country is at different points, each country has different natural resources, each country has different needs for what they want. But if the overall picture is the world moving now, the impulse from Paris, the world moving towards a low-carbon economy over time, then that's exactly what the world needs.
Wang Tao, pick up on Nick's point there that obviously we're going to be burning a lot of fossil fuels. There will be more emissions. China is still building coal power plants, but also China is investing heavily in green technologies of the future. Is this a contradiction?
No, I think it's quite interesting that we have the smogs in both Beijing and Delhi in the first day of the COP21 when it started. But I think that also reflects the kind of challenges that the developing countries faces. It did not actually weaken the foundation of those emerging economies to take stronger actions, but actually strengthen the foundation because they realize that we have to deal with both the short-term challenges of the air pollution as well as the medium and long-term needs to reduce the carbon emissions. So you see that China is building the coal-fired power plants, but those coal-fired power plants are much more efficient compared with the old ones. They're replacing the inefficient and smaller ones, but at the same time, China is also trying very hard to building more of the renewable energies. The growth of the wind and solar energies in China is far greater compared with the fossil fuels. For example, in 2014, China actually building more wind power capacity compared with coal-fired power plants, and the generation is also increasing more compared with coal-fired generations. So if you look at the picture of the world, China is also leading as a world leaders in terms of investing in the clean energies. China invested about $80 billion in 2014 in the green energy and the clean technologies, almost equal to the level of the US and EU combined. So you see that China is trying to clean up the fossil fuel use and using the highly efficient power plants to replace the old ones, but at the same time to push up the shares of renewables and low carbon technology energies in the future energy mix. So I think this is actually a good foundation to move forward. And of course, we have to realize the challenge still lies ahead for emerging economies like China and India, how to balance the difficulties of managing the air pollutions in the short terms and at the same time not really causing big problems for the climate change.
Wang Tao, I take your point that obviously the developing countries are in a different box. China and the US showing leadership incredibly from last November and having an effect in Paris. I want to talk a bit about leadership to you, Nick, in terms of the United States. But first of all, let's listen to US President Barack Obama at the opening of the conference.
14 of the 15 warmest years on record have occurred since the year 2000. And 2015 is on pace to be the warmest year of all. No nation, large or small, wealthy or poor, is immune to what this means.
Now, the US, obviously, Nick, the richest nation in the world, is now the second biggest emitter. A lot of people looking for leadership, but there is a lot of climate skepticism in this country, especially in the US Congress, who will end up financing developing countries for mitigating what's happening with climate change, but also planning for the future. Is that a big worry hanging over the Paris conference? And also, the US won't accept a legally binding treaty, it seems.
Well, look, there are a lot of issues to be debated over the next 2 weeks. The United States is showing leadership not just at the federal government level, but showing leadership at the levels of states. I mean, you look at some of the extraordinary efforts of California, which I know we often mention, but there are many, many more states moving into the low-carbon space. There are many, many cities acting in the United States. There are many corporations and businesses. So, you know, this isn't just a question of governments, which is absolutely vital, of course, but it's a question of a whole transition of your society towards the low-carbon space, and that is clearly happening in the United States. And actually, the transition to a low-carbon economy globally is now irreversible. I mean, it's irrevocable. It's happening everywhere. Paris needs to give it a catalyst so it can go faster.
Well, obviously there's some optimism, Nick, going into this conference, but everyone remembers Copenhagen in 2009, which sort of ended in disarray. It's probably going to go down to the wire, correct, in Paris? Not everything is I's are dotted and T's crossed. Are we going to see it go down to the wire in terms of negotiations?
Well, you know, we have the climate action plans of nations. That's not going to change. These have come in advance. That was very different to Copenhagen, right, where people basically negotiated their mitigation, their emission reduction actions. These have all happened now well in advance of Paris. One of the big issues is certainly going to be finance. Can we give the confidence, or can the developed countries give the confidence to developing countries that the $100 billion that was promised will actually be delivered? And that would be very important. That's about confidence rather than anything else. That will be very central to the discussions over the next 2 weeks.